His BFF spread vicious lies I was cheating minutes before our vows. He laughed. She's joking. So I made him watch me destroy our wedding and his world. My wedding day turned into a nightmare just 1 hour before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. And it wasn't the weather or the dress or anything you could predict. It was a brutal betrayal, not just by a guest, but by the man I was about to marry. Jacob and I had been together for 7 years. I trusted him. I loved him. But in one moment, he proved I'd been blind. It started when I got a text from an unknown number. Just a few words, cold and smug. Thought you should see what she's really like. Attached was a screenshot of fake DMs, supposedly from me, saying I didn't love Jacob and had been cheating. My heart stopped. Within minutes, my maid of honor, Anne, rushed in. Her face was pale. "It's everywhere," she whispered. Another bridesmaid showed me her phone. Same message. Khloe, Jacob's childhood best friend, had created a massive group chat with guests from both sides and dropped the fake screenshots like a bomb. Friends, family, coworkers, all of them saw it. Lies. Poison. Sent on the morning of my wedding. And Jacob's reaction? He laughed. When I confronted him, shaking with rage, showing him the messages, I expected shock, anger, support. But instead, he shrugged, ran a hand through his perfect wedding hair and said, "Come on, Nancy. You know Khloe. It's probably just one of her dumb pranks. Don't make a scene." A scene? My name was being dragged through the mud in front of everyone we knew. And he wanted me to smile through it? Khloe had always been a problem, always too close, always snide and territorial. She treated me like an intruder from day one, rolling her eyes when I spoke, making jokes that cut deep, interrupting Jacob whenever we were alone. But he always brushed it off. That's just Khloe. And I believed him. For 7 years. Every time I raised a concern, he minimized it. Every time she crossed the line, he made excuses. I told myself I was being dramatic, that if I just proved I was secure, kind, understanding, she'd back off. But this wasn't a joke. This was war. Khloe didn't just want to ruin my day. She wanted to destroy me. And Jacob, he defended her. Not me, not us. Her. Standing in that tiny room, bridal gown half zipped, heart torn to pieces, I looked at the man I was about to marry, and I saw a stranger. Not because of what Khloe had done, but because of how he responded. Calm, dismissive, unwilling to stand up for me in the worst moment of my life. He begged me to focus on the ceremony, to deal with it later. But how do you marry someone who won't even acknowledge your pain? That moment snapped something inside me. I realized this wasn't new. It was just the final chapter in a story I'd been too afraid to finish. A story where I was always the one compromising, always the one forgiving. And Jacob? He was always the one choosing Khloe. So I made my decision. I wasn't walking down that aisle. Not for him. Not for someone who let his best friend humiliate me in front of our entire world and told me not to make a scene. This wasn't a prank. This was betrayal. And I finally saw it for what it was. You see, Khloe's shadow wasn't just a recent storm cloud. It had loomed over our entire 7-year relationship. A constant, unsettling presence that Jacob either genuinely couldn't, or more painfully, simply wouldn't acknowledge as the insidious poison it was. He'd always wave away my most valid concerns with that infuriatingly dismissive mantra, "Oh, that's just Khloe being Khloe." He'd say it with a little chuckle, as if her blatantly disrespectful behavior was some adorable, harmless quirk, like a puppy chewing on shoes instead of a deliberate, calculated campaign to ensure her talons remained firmly embedded in his life, and by extension, ours. I remember one incident crystal clear, about 2 years into what I then believed was our blissful journey together. It should have been more than a red flag. It was a blaring, screaming siren. I was on the precipice of a massive career step, prepping for a presentation that felt like it held my entire professional future in its balance. Jacob, my devoted boyfriend, had promised, pinky swore even, to be my rock that evening, to help me review my slides, to be my sounding board, my cheerleader. The night before D-Day, as I was drowning in a sea of anxiety index cards and lukewarm coffee, Khloe initiated her SOS, a frantic, hysterical call to Jacob. Apparently, a mere dripping faucet in her apartment, something a child could ignore, had somehow morphed into a full-blown Titanic-level crisis that demanded his immediate, personal, and heroic intervention. Without a second thought for my impending career-defining moment, he dropped everything, my notes, my pleas, my sanity, and bolted to her side, the valiant knight rescuing his damsel in plumbing distress. He was gone for what felt like an eternity, literal hours, and the disaster that had torn him from my side? A slowly dripping tap, something the building superintendent, who she never even bothered to call, could have handled in under 10 minutes with a basic wrench. I ended up navigating that critical prep session utterly alone, fueled by resentment and cheap energy drinks, feeling not just secondary, but practically invisible. When I finally cautiously tried to explain how much it had hurt, how insignificant and abandoned I felt, he just blinked at me with that now familiar vacant incomprehension and said, with a tone of genuine surprise at my audacity, "But Nancy, it was a real emergency for her. She was panicking." Then there was the debacle of our 5th anniversary. This wasn't just any dinner. This was the dinner. We were at this breathtaking, incredibly intimate restaurant I'd discovered and booked months in advance. A hidden gem we'd whispered about wanting to experience for years. It was meant to be our sacred space, our night to celebrate half a decade of love. And who, pray tell, waltzes in, completely uninvited, with the brazen confidence of a queen entering her court, just as our beautifully plated appetizers arrived? Khloe, naturally, her excuse, she chirped that Jacob had casually mentioned where we'd be dining, and she just happened to be in the exact same upscale, out-of-the-way neighborhood. A neighborhood, I might add, that was a solid 45-minute drive from her actual apartment. The carefully curated romantic ambiance shattered instantly. The rest of the excruciating evening became the Jacob and Khloe show, a blur of them loudly reminiscing about their endless childhood escapades, obscure inside jokes flying back and forth over my head like enemy aircraft, while I sat there, a silent, awkward, increasingly resentful third wheel. A complete stranger at my own damn anniversary dinner. Jacob just beamed, absolutely radiated, thinking it was the most wonderful, spontaneous surprise, completely and utterly oblivious to my silent, simmering fury. "She's like family, Nancy," he'd declared later with an almost patronizing air when I finally, tearfully, voiced my deep frustration and disappointment. Family. That became his all-purpose, magic word excuse for every single boundary she gleefully stomped all over. And the comments. Oh, sweet heavens. The constant, subtle, venom-laced little digs she'd masterfully weave into conversations, all meticulously designed to undermine me, to subtly remind me at every turn that I was the outsider, the interloper in their sacred, lifelong duo. She'd make a point of loudly, almost performatively, praising Jacob's ex-girlfriends in my presence, gushing about how incredibly fiery one was, or how brilliantly intellectual another had been, usually punctuated by a slow, deliberate, assessing look in my direction. Or she'd erupt into these fits of hilarious laughter over Jacob's supposed wild, reckless pre-Nancy days, often winking at him conspiratorially as if they shared a vault of scandalous secrets I'd never be cool enough or trusted enough to be privy to. Every single time I tried to articulate to Jacob how deeply uncomfortable her words made me, how it felt like she was deliberately, methodically trying to chip away at my confidence in our bond, he'd sigh that long-suffering sigh, run his hand through his hair, that same damn infuriating gesture he'd later use on our wedding day, and tell me I was being far too sensitive or completely reading too much into things or my personal favorite, just not getting Khloe's unique sense of humor. He never once, not a single damn time in 7 long years, told Khloe her behavior was inappropriate or out of line. He never ever defended me. It was always invariably me who had to adjust, to understand, to make excuses, to tolerate her. And like the biggest fool in the universe, I did. Because I loved him, and I kept clinging to the naive, desperate hope that one day surely he'd finally open his eyes and truly see. As the months blurred into years, this toxic dynamic, Jacob's unwavering allegiance to Khloe and his casual dismissal of my feelings, didn't just continue. It solidified, becoming the cracked and crumbling foundation of our relationship. I was perpetually walking on eggshells, trying to preempt Khloe's next move, to shield our rare moments of peace from her inevitable intrusions. The wedding planning, which I had naively envisioned as this joyful, collaborative journey for Jacob and me quickly devolved into yet another battleground, where Chloe's desires inexplicably took precedence. It was like she saw the wedding not as a celebration of our love, but as her ultimate stage to assert her dominance, her irreplaceability in Jacob's life. She had vehemently strong, often unsolicited, opinions on everything. The venue? The one I'd fallen in love with, a charming little vineyard, was apparently too rustic and not really Jacob's style, according to Chloe, who then pushed for a much larger, flashier, and significantly more expensive hotel ballroom that she adored. And Jacob, my future husband, he actually tried to convince me it was a more sensible choice, completely ignoring the fact that my heart was set on the vineyard. He'd use that placating tone, "Let's just consider it, Nance, to keep Chloe happy. You know how she gets." Keeping Chloe happy seemed to be his primary directive, far more important than making his future wife happy. The guest list became another minefield. Chloe had a roster of her own friends she insisted had to be there, people I barely knew or in some cases actively disliked due to their association with her. When I tried to gently push back, suggesting we needed to keep numbers manageable, Jacob would sigh dramatically and say things like, "But they're important to Chloe and she's so involved, it would be rude not to include them." It felt like I was planning Chloe's dream wedding, with Jacob as her compliant assistant, and I was just the bride, an inconvenient necessity. She even tried to dictate parts of the catering menu, arguing passionately about canapé choices as if it were a matter of national security, overriding my preferences with Jacob's sheepish approval, because Chloe has a real knack for these things. The sheer audacity of it all was breathtaking, but even more painful was Jacob's consistent failure to put his foot down, to create any sort of boundary between his best friend and his fiancé. Then there were the tasks traditionally and intimately handled by the bridal party or the couple themselves. Chloe, however, managed to bulldoze her way into those too. The most glaring example was Jacob's suit fitting. My brother, who was his best man, was supposed to go with him. But somehow Chloe ended up tagging along, and according to my bewildered brother afterward, she effectively took over the entire appointment. She apparently vetoed Jacob's first choice, a classic, elegant tuxedo he actually liked, deeming it not adventurous enough for him. She then steered him towards something much trendier, something that felt more like her taste than his. When Jacob sheepishly recounted this to me later, almost as a joke, I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. He didn't see it as her overstepping. He saw it as Chloe, just wanting him to look his best. He seemed utterly incapable of recognizing her behavior as controlling or inappropriate. My voice, my opinions, my desires were consistently drowned out by Chloe's louder, more demanding ones. And Jacob, my supposed partner, was the one handing her the megaphone, time and time again. The closer we got to the wedding day, the more I felt like I was on a runaway train, heading towards a disaster I was powerless to prevent, because the man I loved was too blind or too weak to stop it. The final weeks leading up to what was supposed to be our wedding day felt less like a joyful countdown, and more like being slowly and inexorably dragged towards a cliff edge by an invisible current. The unease that had been a nagging whisper for years had crescendoed into a deafening internal siren, a constant thrum of anxiety. I was desperately, almost manically, trying to drown out with an endless flurry of last-minute seating charts, floral arrangements, and painfully forced smiles. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every instance of Jacob's casual betrayals. Every single time he'd unthinkingly, or perhaps quite deliberately, chosen Chloe's ego, her whims, her manufactured dramas, over my clearly expressed needs and my increasingly fragile heart. It was like watching a horror movie where I was the main character, screaming at the screen, "Don't go in there," but powerless to change the script. Take, for instance, the soul-crushing discovery that he'd been sharing the most sacred, intimate details of our life with her. Not just surface-level anecdotes, but the raw, vulnerable core of our relationship. The stupid arguments we'd had over who left the cap off the toothpaste, the deeply personal insecurities I'd only ever whispered to him in the dark, even our private, tentative discussions about future baby names or the kind of old couple we hoped to become. I found out by the cruelest of accidents. We were at some dreadful group dinner Chloe had orchestrated, and she made this offhand snide comment, directly referencing a very specific, very personal fear I'd confessed to Jacob during a moment of extreme vulnerability only weeks before. The way she said it, with a little smirk and a knowing glance at Jacob, told me everything. My blood ran cold. Later, when I confronted Jacob, my voice trembling with a potent cocktail of fury and humiliation, his face was a study in wounded innocence. "She's my best friend, Nance," he'd exclaimed, as if that were some divine absolution. "I tell her everything. It's not a big deal. You're overreacting." Overreacting? My trust, my innermost self, had been laid bare, served up like a piece of gossip for Khloe to dissect, analyze, and undoubtedly mock with him later. It felt like a profound, almost physical violation. Yet he couldn't, or simply wouldn't, grasp the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. He genuinely seemed to believe that his bond with Khloe granted him unrestricted access to my soul, with her as the co-owner. And then there were our supposed romantic getaways, which Khloe had an uncanny knack for transforming into awkward, unwanted group vacations. I painstakingly planned our 4th anniversary trip to this secluded beachfront cabin, dreaming of quiet sunsets and uninterrupted conversations. 2 weeks before we were due to leave, Khloe spontaneously announced she'd booked a non-refundable solo trip to a wellness retreat, just a 10-minute drive from our cabin, for the exact same dates. And what a hilarious coincidence, Jacob had boomed, completely missing the icy dread that gripped me. Of course, the coincidence meant that huge chunks of our precious anniversary time were spent fending off Khloe's texts about meeting up, or worse, actually meeting up. Jacob, ever the conflict avoider where Khloe was concerned, insisted it would be unbelievably rude not to include her in at least a few meals or activities. So our candlelit dinners for two morphed into strained threesomes, our peaceful beach walks punctuated by Khloe's incessant chatter about herself. My quiet pleas for it to be just the two of us, for this one trip to be ours, were met with Jacob's now standard accusations. I was being jealous, insecure, or trying to sabotage his most important friendship. He made me feel like a petty, demanding shrew for simply wanting my partner's undivided attention on a trip meant to celebrate our love. Even my own damn birthdays weren't safe. I remember for my 27th, all I wanted was a low-key dinner at our favorite neighborhood Italian place, just him and me. I'd been working killer hours and was craving simplicity and connection. He agreed, seemed enthusiastic even. Then, on the afternoon of my actual birthday, as I was getting ready, he casually, almost breezily announced, "Oh, by the way, I invited Khloe to join us for dinner. She sounded a bit down, she'd be absolutely crushed if she was left out of your birthday celebration." My birthday, not hers, not theirs, mine. But once again, it was all about anticipating and managing Khloe's potential emotional state, never about considering mine. That dinner was predictably awful. Khloe spent the entire time either subtly one-upping any story I told or engaging Jacob in intense, whispered conversations that clearly excluded me, all while Jacob beamed at her, seemingly oblivious to my growing misery. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were the drumbeat of our relationship, a relentless, soul-crushing pattern of him choosing her. With every dismissive wave of his hand, with every excuse he made for her appalling behavior, a small, vital piece of my love and respect for him fractured and fell away. I felt like I was constantly on trial, desperately trying to prove I was worthy of being his primary partner, a role Khloe seemed hell-bent on ensuring I'd never truly occupy. The closer the wedding day loomed, the more frantic my internal bargaining became. "Maybe once the vows are said," I'd whisper to myself in the dead of night, "once we're legally, irrevocably bound, things will magically change. The wedding certificate will be a shield, a fortress. He'll have to choose me then." Oh, what a naive, desperate, pathetic fool I was. The wedding wasn't going to be a solution. It was merely the meticulously set stage for the most public, the most humiliating, the most devastating display of his true, unwavering loyalties. The storm hadn't just been brewing. It had been a Category 5 hurricane all along, and I'd just been too damn busy, too damn hopeful, too damn invested, trying to patch the gaping holes in our sinking ship to acknowledge I was already drowning. The air in those final days felt thick with unspoken truths and a terrible, palpable sense of impending doom. The bridal suite, an hour before the ceremony. I was a bundle of nerves and lace, trying to breathe through the suffocating weight of foreboding that had clung to me for weeks. Then, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. A sneering message. "Thought you should see what she's really like," being talked about among guests. Attached, a series of vile, fabricated screenshots. Me, confessing to an affair, doubting my love for Jacob. My world fractured. Anne, my maid of honor, saw my face and gasped when I showed her. Minutes later, the confirmation, another bridesmaid's phone lit up. Her cousin, already at the venue, texted that KHLOE had created a massive group chat with guests, blasting them with the fake cheating story. Khloe. This was her endgame, a public execution of my character. I felt an icy calm descend. I found my brother, his face etched with concern, and asked him to bring Jacob to a small, private anteroom. No one else. Jacob rushed in, flustered, annoyed at being pulled from his pre-wedding greetings. I held up my phone, the fabricated filth clear on the screen. Khloe sent this to everyone, I said, my voice flat, devoid of the storm raging inside. His reaction? A nervous, dismissive laugh. Oh, come on, Nance, he said, running a hand through his perfect hair. You know Khloe. It's just a stupid, elaborate prank. She's got a weird sense of humor. A prank? My reputation shredded, our wedding guests thinking I was a cheater, and he called it a prank? I stared, waiting for the anger, the defense of me. It never came. She wouldn't really try to stop the wedding, he added, as if that excused anything. And what are you going to do? I whispered, the words catching in my throat. About Khloe? About our guests? He sighed, that familiar sound of impatience I knew so well. Look, we're literally minutes from starting. Let's not make a scene. It's just Khloe being Khloe. Don't let her ruin our day. We'll sort it later. Just ignore it for now. Ignore it. Those two words were like a bucket of ice water, snapping everything into sharp, painful focus. His priority wasn't me, my pain, or the truth. It was avoiding embarrassment, maintaining the facade. His casual dismissal of Khloe's vicious, calculated attack, his immediate instinct to protect her by minimizing her actions, his utter disregard for my public humiliation. It was the culmination of 7 years of him choosing her, of me being secondary. This wasn't just about Khloe anymore. This was about Jacob. And in that moment, I saw him clearly for the first time. A man who would never, ever truly stand by me if it meant confronting his precious Khloe. If you think this is something that can be ignored, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, if you think her deliberately trying to destroy me is a joke, then I can't marry you. Your refusal to stand up for me, for US, against this, it tells me everything I need to know. He started to argue, his voice rising in panic. Nancy, you're overreacting. We're about to get married. But I was done. I turned, walked out of that suffocating room, past the blurred, worried faces of my mother and bridesmaids. I'm leaving, I told my stunned brother. He reached for me, questions in his eyes, but I just shook my head and kept walking. Through a side door, into the indifferent afternoon sun, I hailed the first taxi I saw. As it pulled away from the venue, from the life I thought I wanted, my phone began to ring. Jacob, my mother, my father. I let it ring. The sound of my old life, desperately trying to pull me back. But I was already gone. The drive away from that venue, the monument to my shattered dreams, was a blur of motion and unshed tears. My phone, which I'd numbly tossed onto the passenger seat, immediately began its relentless assault. Jacob's name flashed, then my mother's, then my father's, then Anne's. Again and again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What was there to say? How could I articulate the depth of a betrayal that had just ripped my world apart at the seams? I just stared blankly out the window as the pristine wedding venue, with its perfectly manicured lawns and tables groaning under the weight of uneaten food, receded into the distance, a painful symbol of a future that had just been violently erased. I checked into the first anonymous, decent-looking hotel I could find. The click of the door locking behind me, the loudest sound I'd heard in hours. Once in the sterile silence of the room, the dam finally broke. The missed calls had piled up. Dozens from Jacob. A frantic barrage from my parents, my siblings, even some from Jacob's bewildered parents. Anne had texted too. A stream of updates painting a picture of utter chaos at the venue. Jacob, she said, was apparently frantic, alternating between desperately trying to find me and attempting to manage the shell-shocked guests. And Khloe? According to Anne, that venomous snake was already hard at work, slithering among the guests, spinning her poisonous narrative. I'd inexplicably gotten cold feet. I was unstable. I was making up these wild accusations against her to cover my own reasons for bolting. The audacity was breathtaking, yet entirely predictable. It had only been about 10 hours since I'd walked out. 10 hours since I'd detonated my own life. I'd spoken briefly, mechanically to my parents, just enough to assure them I was physically safe, but far from ready to dissect the implosion. Jacob's calls and texts hadn't stopped, a relentless flood of digital desperation. His messages were a chaotic symphony of bewilderment. Where are you? What happened? Then accusation. How could you do this to us, Nancy? To me? And finally, the inevitable pleading, please, please come back. We can fix this. I know we can. Fix this? He still didn't get it. He never would. Khloe's malicious stunt was just the catalyst, the ugly symptom of a much deeper disease. The real sickness was his spineless refusal to ever defend me, his consistent casual dismissal of her poison, his choice, time and time again, to prioritize her feelings, her drama, over mine. That was the betrayal. That was the unfixable part. As I sat there in that cold, impersonal hotel room, the echoes of what was supposed to be my wedding day mocking me, one thing was terrifyingly, liberatingly clear. My future would not include him. The calls could keep coming. He could plead all he wanted. But the Nancy who would have forgiven him, the Nancy who would have made excuses for him, had died in that little room at the wedding venue. This new Nancy, she was just getting started.